us begin. All right, so there's going to be a couple videos connected to the sociocultural aspect of writing. I'm starting with one on ethnography and thick descriptions, and this is more of a practical piece of the sociocultural. Ethnography is a specific type of writing connected to the sociocultural, and so when we look at ethnography, it's a specific genre that's focused on writing about culture. It often is connected to other types of writing or subgenres that some field notes, thick descriptions. We do analysis of cultural artifacts. So this is very much a social sciences, anthropology, humanities-based form of writing. That being said, it is a qualitative way of gathering data, and so it still very much links to the scientific aspect of writing. So with that, let's dive into this. And just if it helps, remember that it is a genre of writing. A genre is any type or form of communication with socially agreed upon norms or conventions. So there are certain expectations a reader is going to have when they look at ethnography. So let's make sure we know what it is. So let's start here. So when we talk about ethnography, let's go the long way around. Let's start by looking first. We might try Googling it. I like to give my students a source I found from Gale Virtual Reference. It's one of those 2-page articles. It's one of the reasons why looking for research in your library databases can be really good. You find really short things that go deep really fast. So ethnography is the study of people in a natural setting, according to Erin Elizabeth Robinson Caskey in the Encyclopedia of Anthropology. So it's a study of people in natural settings. It provides an opportunity for research to conduct detailed study of a group of people while being immersed in the culture of a group. So we'll talk about some of these ways. Ethnography comes from ethno, or people, and graphy, which is the root word we've talked about in other places, graphia, which means to write or carve out, or in this case, she uses the definition, the more metaphorical definition of to describe something. It's the root word for writing in a lot of places. Sometimes referred to as participant observation or field research, and all that fun stuff. So I give this to my students as a quick overview of what ethnography is. I think one of my favorite parts about it is that ethnography helps us deal with hard to pin down environments, hard to pin down studies. We're looking at something that has a lot of complexity to it, and we're trying to figure out how to approach it. And so it is a qualitative method because if we have a problem we're trying to solve, or a study we're trying to do, or knowledge we're trying to gain, but it's embedded in a context that has, very broad, ambiguous, or poorly defined boundaries, research topics like that, ethnography is really great for that. And so ethnography is simply writing about culture. In my class, we do ethnographies about writing context. So we do an ethnography with the focus on writing. And so I'll have them, and I've got a prompt that talks about my digital writing culture, or ethnography of a digital culture kind of thing. And you can look at that and see some of those things. But just here's ethnography. Ethnography studies culture. It's writing about culture, and it uses something called thick descriptions to do that. Now for my students, I also have a secondary presentation that I borrow because I don't feel the need to reinvent the wheel, that goes through a lot more depth on this. And so adds a little more about this, and specifically when we get into types of observation, participant versus non-participant, structured or unstructured, we can look at some of these different things. Participant versus non-participant is that traditional emic, etic study, and I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But one of the big things when we discuss ethnography is that first step of field notes, first step of unstructured observation. So this is in the early phase of research. I'm not necessarily ready to start writing an essay yet because I need to gain some understanding to figure out what my essay is going to be about in the first place, or what my project, or what it is that I'm trying to study in the first place. What is this culture in this environment that I'm looking at? So it may become specific. Unstructured observation may become specific to when and where to observe, what specific aspects of the setting or behavior to observe, and how to make and record observations. So when we're doing unstructured observations, we might take a notebook and pen, or whatever recording device or writing writing technology you have. We might note down things that stand out to us, interesting things, weird things, intriguing things. Like, wow, the thing, I look at it and I'm like, my eye's being drawn here, or my attention is being focused here, or that was really weird, but nobody else around seemed to think it was weird. It was just me. And so, you can write down theories as you form them because it's unstructured as observation. It's almost like an in the environment brainstorming when you're doing field notes. But be careful not to jump to conclusions straight away. I'll talk about one way to do that in a moment with Gertz's thick descriptions. And you want to look for evidence. You want to gather data, even if it's qualitative. You want to do observation, and then you can ask people to confirm things. A lot of times, ethnographies will include one-on-one interviews, surveys, that sort of thing, and I might have a video at that at a later date. But for now, ethnography starts with field notes and is used, and field notes are doing these raw data gathering moments, and we want to make sure we're doing description and analysis first so that the data starts from a place of observation before we jump to conclusions. So let's look into that a little more here. So first, what is a thick description? So for thick descriptions are often attributed to Clifford Geertz, 1973. It's basically a subgenre, a micro form of writing inside larger projects, and so he discusses the role of an ethnographer in his writing. He talks about how ethnographers aim to observe, record, and analyze a culture, and he says we have to interpret signs to gain their meaning within the culture itself. And so this interpretation should be based on thick description of a sign in order to see all the possible meanings. So he gives the example of a wink of an eye, and so when a person winks, he may merely rapidly contract his eyelids, but there's a secondary level, which means doing something deceptive or conspiratorial. And so an ethnographer's more participant-oriented analysis or interpretation, those thick descriptions are going to give that secondary sense or meaning or semantic or semiotic context a little bit. So that is a thick description. Now, even as we look at that, if you don't know and you're one of my students, what most of my students are probably going to do when I ask them to do field notes or when I ask them to think about thick descriptions is they're going to go Google it. But just I'll walk you through that in a minute, and we'll talk through some of the different ways. But one, thick descriptions are essentially taking a minute, looking around, describing what you see, and adding a hint and adding soft analysis and some interpretation that allows someone looking at that data at a later point in time to yourself or someone else to understand not just the what of what was happening, but how the context changed the way it should be interpreted. And so it's not just this person said this, it's they said this and they winked. It's they said this and they gave a smile. They said this and they patted someone on the shoulder. They said this and then they punched somebody in the face. Like, all of those things can change if you had the same statement, they said this, and insert statement here. Those secondary contexts or behaviors would need deeper analysis or interpretation to understand what's really happening. So that's how thick description works. It's basically an analytical free write in field note form. So it's basically analytical free write where I'm describing what I see and trying to piece together what it is that I'm working on, what it is that I'm trying to understand. So moving on, so as we think about these things, field notes, thick descriptions go in them, but that's not all. So let's make sure that we walk through it. One, I don't usually recommend going to Wikipedia for things because you never know who is going to be, you can't attribute you can't give author credit, and that's one of the problems. And it's why when you go through some things on Wikipedia, you see all this citation needed and all that. And if you are someone who you just read an article and you come across something like that on Wikipedia and you just found an academic source, drop it in so that people know where you got it from. However, as a first step, I remember doing jobs working at a blockyard, trying to understand things about sealers and what is lacquer and all these other things in the context I was in construction. And I went straight to Wikipedia because, who's going to go and mess with stuff on Wikipedia about that? But we should always be careful. There are rumors of instructors or professors going in and changing the Wikipedia page a day or two before a test in case someone's trying to study from it, blah, blah, blah. That's wrong. But I'm just saying it's out there. But it's a place to start if you're not sure, but there are better places to start, and we'll talk about it later in just a minute. But you can go and you can look at, there's stuff on field notes. You can even scroll through, get some basic information, see references people have put on there. That's not necessarily a bad thing. This describes field notes as a qualitative note recorded by a scientist in the course of field research and gives a couple links. So you can kind of get a general sense. It's not but this isn't something you would necessarily cite in an academic article. In fact, it would be highly discouraged. Most instructors don't want to see Wikipedia. There are some studies coming out to talk about the validity of Wikipedia, but I still don't think we're going to get to a place where someone's going to see it as a legitimate source for quite some time. So it's better to use it as a stepping stone to get your mind in the right place or to find some key research terms to get deeper. So as you do that, I'll walk you through what that'll look like in a library database. I did like this as a picture because some parts of field notes involve drawing your own pictures, drawing the scene, mapping something out. A lot of anthropologists and researchers will take pictures or will draw out sketches of everything from weapons cultures used to pipes to any artifacts, cultural artifacts in that space. So just to zoom in on this picture that was given, field notes can be messy, they can be hand drawn. They're there to kind of be a placeholder of knowledge where you dump what you're seeing in so that later on when you're in research mode and what does this mean mode, you have enough information that you can use it when you're not sitting in the environment, that you can understand what's going on. Yep, and so then one last thing before I go and walk you through library database is we could look up some other things. I mentioned the emic, etic perspective, and so it's basically those two types of research, two different viewpoints where you're either from the perspective of the subject, you're a participant. It means you're already involved in this culture. So for instance, you're using an emic perspective when you go to study an environment you're already a participant of. If you already play World of Warcraft, you have an account, you've been playing for years, and then you go to study the culture of World of Warcraft like some of my students do. They'll look at the writing culture, or with my math learning community, they looked at the math and writing that shows up in the game, how player stats and character stats worked out and were communicated. That's an emic thing because you're already a participant in that culture. Edik means that you don't know much about World of Warcraft, but maybe your brother, your boyfriend, your sister, your girlfriend, maybe they play and you're like, okay, well, it's a chance for me to get to know something about something that they care about. And I care about them, so vicariously I should care about what they care about in some ways. So then I'm going to take an outsider perspective. I'm still going to go create a login and try and play the game, but as I analyze it, I'm doing it from someone who isn't a member of that community. So that's kind of how emic and etic work. If I wanted to study my classroom or someone else's classroom, if I'm a student in that classroom already and enrolled and then suddenly want to start saying, okay, well, how do they do things as a culture? What are the cultural values, beliefs, and norms? If I'm a student, I'm in the emic perspective. If I am coming from the outside as a classroom researcher, or if when I'm doing faculty observations of their teaching, I'm an outsider to that environment, but I'm still gathering data and doing research and analyzing. So that's an etic perspective. So student would be emic, who's already a member, professor or observer from the outside, etic. Okay, so we talked about, yes, you could find some of these things out on Wikipedia, but you can also dig into your school's library databases. For Maricopa Community Colleges, specifically Chandler Gilbert, where I'm a professor, we have this big, cool list of library databases that we can use. And of course, my screen is not wanting to scroll over. But I would go to the Gale Virtual Reference Library. It's under the encyclopedic sources. And so that's going to give me background information that are from trusted sources that are written by scholars. And that takes it a level up into the scholarly realm from anyone on Wikipedia who might happen to think they know. And so when we do that, if you're from outside, if you're doing this from home, like a lot of my students are right now because it's an online summer class, you may drill down into one of these databases, and before you can even get in, you have to log in with your MAID and password to do that, and then it'll let you go and do some of your get into some of your research. So that's how I found this article. Actually, I will go back and then come back into it. So that's how I found this article. It gave me a bunch of sources on, I just typed in creating field notes, and it gave me a bunch of books that are connected to, some of them didn't quite make sense, which is kind of what happens sometimes. I typed in field notes, but as I scroll through, some of these are on poets, and I don't understand that. But this one, Participant Observer, it's in Encyclopedia of Law and Society, but it talks about what is this thing. It may be in that specific context, but it still will give me the general idea in an academic source that will help me understand this thing. So participant observation, I could keep going and scroll down and see what else I can find. A lot qualitative, ethnographic, performative approaches to communication. That's on the money. That's a source someone could use if they're going to talk about this type of research in an article. There's even ones on media practices, and as far as culture and whatnot, that's as far as I'm going to go. Let me go back into that source I had on qualitative methods, the Sage Encyclopedia of Lifespan Human Development. So they had the reason this stood out to me, I think, was because it mentioned qualitative methods in the description, and so I can scroll down and this is a source I can jump to. It also had field notes in this. So it talks about, during participant observation, the researcher takes part in social activities while simultaneously observing and recording activities and interactions through the writing of detailed field notes. For example, a researcher might study parent and preschool children playground socializing by coming to a neighborhood park and becoming part of the regular attenders and recording notes to track how parents' social networks affect children's play patterns. You know, if Sally's mom doesn't like Barbara's mom, then maybe they sit on opposite ends of the playground, or maybe they're more faster to get onto their kids if they get too close. I don't know. But that's something you could study, but you'd only know by seeing the pattern over time, potentially. For example, a researcher, okay, yes. So these notes serve as the data to be analyzed, yet as with any method, the observational method has inherent limitations. People may behave differently when being watched. This is also one of the reasons why when you do research on people, you have to be really careful what kind of research you do. There's an ethics level to it about studying people and when to get consent for the study and when not to. So there are actually national laws in the U.S. that cover these sorts of things. So we want to be aware. So people may behave differently when they're being watched, although ethnography attempts to minimize this by the researcher spending extended periods of time in the setting. Field notes record human activity through the lens of a person observing. In addition, field notes cannot capture individuals' thoughts, motivations, or beliefs. Often these notes are combined with interviews to gain both the external and internal aspects of the culture, because otherwise what we start doing is we might look at a behavior and we are trying to understand the culture. We are trying to understand people and their beliefs and how their actions are motivated by beliefs. But we really, in these messy environments, like we said, with ethnography, it has these, with broad, hard to understand or research topics, it can be really hard to look into culture. It's a messy thing. It's complex because humans are complex. So we are trying to understand the logic behind the behaviors of the humans in this environment, whatever it is that we're studying, whether it's writing or how people eat or how people interact as in familial settings or whatever it is. The social dynamics of a situation are hard to pin down, but often, and we'll talk more about this in the other sociocultural videos, but we're looking at how beliefs establish social norms that become common practices, and how does someone's actions tie back to their thought process. So we have to look at the actions and we can infer or interpret, but we have to be really careful how we do that. But as a first step with ethnography, field notes are first just getting data, getting data that does soft analysis and soft interpretation with enough tangible description for you after the fact to go back and say, oh yeah, that's not just what was happening, but I think this is how it might be happening or why it might be happening. It gets, so then you're providing a hint of interpretation or soft analysis even in those thick descriptions in your field notes. Field notes should include pictures. They should include hand-drawn maps or pictures or something that does more than just describe what's happening. Sometimes if you're analyzing an online culture, it can help to do a screenshot of certain things, whether it's a logo or an organizational menu or a comment section. These are all possible things. In a normal classroom setting, I'll have my students study. I've had students do analyses of like a chemistry class or a math class, and they'll go and take pictures of protractors and pencils and erasers and the projector screen or the way the desks are organized. All of these are meaningful data that help us figure out how beliefs are being played out in that environment in action. All right, so with that, this is ethnography. It's part of the sociocultural aspect of writing. It's a specific genre, usually in anthropology, the humanities, and social sciences, and it involves field notes, thick description, and analysis of cultural artifacts. So with that, this will be the first this will be one video in connection to the sociocultural aspect of writing. It's meant to be more practical. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions or if I messed up somewhere in here.